Barakata Yahweh, Barakata Yahushai, Bayishim, Baraka Kudash, Barakatum. First and foremost, I want to give all praises, glory, and infinite honors to Yahweh, Bayishim, Yahushai. Double honors to the apostles and elders of Great Millstone who ruled and teach well. And peace and salutations to Ya'akim out there, pushing this word in truth and sincerity to the four corners of the globe. May you brothers endure until the end. This is the Brother Raya with another video, and I'll be reading from an article on RT.com titled, U.S. is willing to dismantle the UN Security Council to put pressure on Iran. And this is just another indicator that Esau Edom, the so-called white man's kingdom, is divided, as it says in Daniel chapter 2. This is Daniel chapter 2. I'm going to read verse 40 to 41. And this is talking about the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream, which are the heathen kingdoms that would rule before the kingdom of heaven, ruled by the true children of Israel, who are the so-called Negroes, Latinos, and Native Americans, was ushered in. You had the head of gold, which was the ancient Babylonian Empire, the arms and breast of silver, the Medo-Persian Empire, the belly and thighs of brass, the Grecian Empire, which was ruled by the Edomites, and the legs of iron, the ancient Roman Empire, also ruled by the Edomites. And the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, those legs of iron, for as much as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things, and as iron that breaketh all these, shall it break in pieces and bruise. And whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, the last leg of the fourth kingdom, the reincarnated Roman Empire, the NATO-EU alliance that the U.S. is a part of, the final kingdom of the heathens, ruled by Esau Edom, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, but there shall be in it of the strength of the iron, for as much as thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay. And as we'll see from the information in that article, this kingdom is clearly divided. You've got the U.S. continuing to try to dismantle the Iranian nuclear deal, which the European Edomites don't want, because they know that if the deal falls apart, it's only going to fast track a war with Iran, which they'll get dragged into. And the U.S. is pushing for a war with Iran at the behest of the state of Israel. And that war will happen and play into the bigger battle in the Valley of Jehoshaphat in that Middle Eastern region that all you heathen nations are going to get dragged down into. And it's going to be punishment from Yahweh Bayishim Yahushai for all the afflictions that you heathens have put onto the apple of his eye, the true children of Israel, again, the so-called Negroes, Latinos, and Native Americans, not just in the past, but all the way up until today. And the chief nation that afflicted the children of Israel were you Edomites. And even besides the Iranian nuclear deal, there's a plethora of other reasons why this kingdom is divided, and these European Edomites have animosity towards those American Edomites, and vice versa. These European Edomites are sick of American military adventurism abroad, which they get dragged into and usually feel the blowback from, such as the refugee crisis caused by the war in Libya and the Syrian civil war. And the European Edomites are sick of the Americans meddling in their economic affairs, such as the U.S. meddling in the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project, which is a joint project between Germany and France. And you've got these American Edomites mad at the Europeans because they feel that they're not covering the costs of NATO. And then you have European Edomites who are just getting sick of the European Union, which led to Brexit. And then you had talks of a Frexit. And ultimately what this is all going to lead to is America's European allies turning against her and allying themselves with America's enemies, such as Russia and China. And together, they're all going to shoot nuclear missiles onto the United States, which is going to turn it into a desolate, uninhabitable wasteland. This is Revelation chapter 17, verse 16. And the 10 horns, which is the European Union, starting with the first 10 common markets back when it was known as the European Economic Community, which thou sawest upon the beast, NATO, these shall hate the whore, the United States of America, which is also biblically known as Babylon the Great, as well as spiritual Sodom and Egypt, as pursuant to Revelation 11, verse 8, and shall make her desolate and naked, and shall eat her flesh, and burn her with fire, that nuclear fire. Let's get back to the article. America versus the world. The problem from the start, however, was that the United States was alone with its displeasure over how the deal was being implemented. Among the other parties to the JCPOA, which is the name for the Iranian nuclear deal, France, Great Britain, Germany, the EU, those 10 horns, Russia, China, and Iran, the agreement was proving its viability by preventing Iran from engaging in any breakout actions that could result in Iran obtaining enough fissile material from its centrifuge-based uranium enrichment program to build a nuclear device. Trump, however, had latched onto the so-called sunset clauses of the JCPOA, which lifted restrictions on Iran's use of centrifuges after a period of several years, allowing Iran to blow past the hypothetical calculations regarding nuclear breakout and thereby mooting the fundamental purpose of the JCPOA to begin with. The U.S. decision to unilaterally withdraw from the JCPOA has proven to be an unmitigated policy disaster, one that has empowered Iran, Russia, and China as the aggrieved parties and driven a wedge between the U.S. and its European allies. Again, and whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. Rather than admit defeat and help restore the status quo by re-entering the JCPOA, the Trump administration has instead opted to double down, threatening to reimpose UN sanctions which had been suspended upon Iran's entry into the JCPOA via procedural mechanisms contained in the body of that agreement, calling for the snapback of sanctions if any party is dissatisfied with the compliance of another. The real purpose of the U.S. gambit to reimpose snapback inspections wasn't any malfeasance on the part of Iran's nuclear program, but rather a desire to prevent the automatic lifting of an arms embargo that had been spelled out in the body of the JCPOA. This embargo was scheduled to automatically terminate come October 2020. As you see, it's always the U.S. that's throwing a monkey wrench in everybody else's plans, which is exactly what America was prophesied to do in Daniel chapter 7. This is Daniel chapter 7, verse 19 to 20. Then I would know the truth of the fourth beast, which was diverse from all the others, exceeding dreadful, whose teeth were of iron, and his nails of brass, which devoured, brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with his feet, the legs of iron, the ancient Roman Empire. And now in the last leg of this fourth beast, the reincarnated Roman Empire, the NATO-EU alliance that the U.S. is a part of, and of the 10 horns that were in his head, and of the other which came up, that little horn, the United States of America, and before whom 3 fell, and that's referring to France, Britain, and Spain, who are the main players in the New World before the 13 colonies became the United States of America that you know today, even of that horn that had eyes and a mouth that spake very great things, whose look was more stout than his fellows. Like I just said, it's the United States of America who's always throwing a monkey wrench in everybody's plans, pushing that American exceptionalism idea that it's my way or the highway, his look being more stout than his fellows, which again is ultimately going to lead to all of America's allies turning against her and allying themselves with America's enemies and together shooting their nuclear missiles onto the U.S. The U.S. sought to pressure the Security Council into passing a resolution which would permanently extend this embargo. Both Russia and China had promised to veto, so the resolution's defeat was inevitable. The goal in pushing for it, however, was to persuade at least 9 other members of the 15-member body to vote in favor, thereby providing the U.S. with the moral high ground when approaching the Security Council about reimposing snapback sanctions. Most of the other members of the Security Council, recognizing that if they intervened to reverse a clause mandated by the JCPOA, they would put Iran's continued participation in the agreement at risk, instead abstained from voting on the resolution. Only the Dominican Republic sided with the US. Russia and China, as expected, cast their vetoes. Trump's deal or no deal, whose look who was more stout than his fellows, having failed to secure the moral high ground, the US could have admitted defeat and regrouped, trying to find another, less controversial way forward. But the US policy of maximum pressure brooks no such weakness, especially when Donald Trump has bragged that he will secure a new deal with Iran within 4 weeks of his being reelected. To even have a shot at this, the US would need to not only maintain the existing unilateral sanctions regime it is enforcing on Iran, but also increase the pressure, something that could only be done by reimposing UN sanctions via the snapback mechanism of the JCPOA. If the US were to succeed in snapping back UN sanctions, the JCPOA would be dead in the water, as there would be no way Iran would continue to comply with an agreement which no longer delivers on its promises. The other parties to the JCPOA understand this and indicated their unwillingness to go along with the US scheme, the kingdom being divided. Moreover, those nations believe that by having withdrawn from the JCPOA, the US was no longer a participant to that agreement, and as such had no jurisdictional or legal authority to initiate the snapback provisions. On August 20th, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, ignoring the warnings from the other JCPOA parties, met with the President of the Security Council for the purpose of delivering a letter announcing that the US was activating the snapback procedures and that in 30 days it would be calling for a vote on the matter by the Security Council, again, whose look was more stout than his fellows. Almost immediately, the US actions were condemned by the other parties of the JCPOA, with France, Great Britain, and Germany, those 10 horns, calling the US move incompatible with our current efforts to support the JCPOA, and both Russia and China terming the effort illegal. Tearing down UNSC is an acceptable outcome for the US. The Trump administration, faced with this united opposition, has shown no indication it is willing to back down. The UN Security Council is navigating uncharted waters, having never been confronted with a challenge of this nature in its 75-year history. There is every reason to believe that the US will submit a resolution for consideration following the expiration of the 30-day notification period and then veto it itself, thereby triggering the automatic snapback of UN sanctions. There is also every reason to believe that the Security Council will seek to block the US through various procedural formalities designed not to formally recognize the US demands and thereby preventing the submission of any resolution. That's it with this article. But as you can see, America is having that look that's more stout than his fellows or his allies, and is trying to make the JCPOA so unappealing to Iran that they'll leave, so then they'll have a further justification along with the state of Israel to say that, look, Iran doesn't want peace. They want to build a nuclear weapon to try to attack the state of Israel, so we're going to have to attack them, which there will be a war with Iran, which is going to play into the bigger battle in the Valley of Jehoshaphat. And again, this is all going to culminate in America's allies turning against her and allying themselves with nations like Russia and China to altogether shoot their nuclear missiles onto the US. Now let's get back into these precepts. This is Jeremiah 50 verse 9. For lo, I will raise and cause to come up against Babylon, the United States of America, an assembly of great nations from the north country, that north country being Russia, because what's north of the United States? Canada, then the Arctic Ocean, and then Russia. And Russia shooting its missiles over the Arctic to hit the US is the shortest trajectory time it would take for Russia's missiles to hit the US. And that assembly of great nations are not only Russia's allies, such as China, North Korea, and Iran, but also the allies of the US, Britain, France, Germany, and these other European Union and NATO nations that are going to turn against her in that day and ally themselves with Russia. Back in Revelation 17, verse 16, and the 10 horns which thou sawest upon the beast, these shall hate the whore, and shall make her desolate and naked, and shall eat her flesh and burn her with fire, that nuclear fire. And they shall set themselves in array against her, against that whore. From thence she shall be taken. Their arrows shall be as of a mighty expert man. None shall return in vain. And those arrows are symbolic for the nuclear missiles, because what you have to remember is that when the prophets saw these visions thousands of years ago, they didn't know what a modern nuclear-tipped ICBM was, so they had to describe it the best way they could with what they knew during their times. Ancient weapons of war, such as bows and arrows, spears, javelins, flying swords, etc., etc. And altogether, these nations are going to shoot 200 million nuclear missiles onto the United States. Close it out in Isaiah 13, verse 19 to 20. And Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldees' excellency, shall be as when the Most High overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. And again, besides being known as Babylon the Great in the scriptures, the United States is also known as spiritual Egypt and Sodom, as pursuant to Revelation 11, verse 8. And how did the Most High overthrow ancient Sodom and Gomorrah? With fire and brimstone from the sky. And he's going to overthrow this modern day Sodom and Gomorrah with modern fire and brimstone from the sky, those nuclear-tipped ICBMs. It shall never be inhabited, neither shall it be dwelt in from generation to generation, neither shall the Arabian pitch tent there, neither shall the shepherds make their fold there. After those 200 million nuclear missiles hit the U.S. and turn it into the biblical lake of fire from sea to shining sea, then it's going to be a desolate, uninhabitable wasteland afterwards that's going to stand as a memorial as to what a wicked kingdom looks like and how not to govern the earth. So with this video, I hope you sincere Akim are edified. Just keep strong and keep pushing this word. We're almost out of this final wicked captivity of the heathens, chiefly Esau, Edom, whose kingdom is divided. And as always, I'm going to say Abad Babol, Kwam Yasharala, and until next time, Shalom.